There were a lot of event movies to talk about that have come out in 2018 that showed trends that have shaped our cinematic past. But there was one movie this year that is truly the embodiment of the modern epoch. One movie that some have described as the most ambitious crossover of all time. One movie that built so skillfully on the cinematic universe that came before it. One movie that is the defining moment of our era. I am talking, of course, about Mamma Mia. Here we go again. Mamma Mia. Here I go again. Oh boy, the great American musical is back. But, on the one hand, high-time cultural milestone voice of a generation for wine moms, Mamma Mia, got a sequel. You know, so being a grudge holder makes you fat. But here's the thing, fam. On top of Movie Pass going bankrupt, it's a streaming world now. I don't like going outside. And I really don't like giving me undivided attention to things. And this newfound medium of streaming is reducing interest in the cinema. I need a gimmick to get me ass out of the house and drive the whole 1.2 miles down to the rolling hills amp so I can see the latest release in 4K. If we have enough gimmicks, then surely interest in the cinema will revive. Or will it? So, obviously, the Hollywood panic of trying to incentivize people to stop watching goddamn Stranger Things on Netflix for the 5th time and to come on out to the movies by pushing the prestige of gimmicks like 3D, 4D, and even 6D applies more to big-budget tentpoles like superhero movies, live-action remakes of Disney classics, and even superhero movies, more than it does the Hollywood musical. But that hasn't always been the case. A long time ago, way back in those halcyon days before Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, I had a segment in me video about Joel Schumacher's Phantom of the Opera, alluding to the crash and ultimately the final dumpster fire resting place of the big Hollywood movie and musical, namely Hello Dolly. But the fall of the great American musical was, of course, much more complicated than just one movie not making its money back. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Because in many regards, the dramatic and expensive death throes of the big Hollywood musical in the 1960s had more in common with our current-day endless glut of sequels, remakes, and superhero movies than it does with Mamma Mia. Here we go again. There was a time when musicals were the biggest game in town. It was a world dominated by Rodgers and Hammerstein, by Julie Andrews, by Jeannie Kelly. For decades, the saccharine Broadway-style musical was the event movie. These were the tentpoles of the mid-20th century, until one day it all came crashing down. With the advent of talkies, it wasn't long before musicals found their way onto the big screen. First through musical shorts featuring popular performers, and eventually full-length features. Ever since the advent of sound, musicals were a consistently popular staple. But in 1939, studios hired producer Arthur Fried, whose production unit went on to create what would eventually become the golden era of movie and musicals, with titles like Easter Parade, On the Town Singing in the Rain, and An American in Paris. And in the 1950s and early 1960s, the way musicals built hype around their big important movies was the roadshow. So what is a roadshow, and how does it fit in here? Well, it's a gimmick. But a gimmick that was, particularly through the 1950s to the 1970s, used to promote more prestige-oriented films. You got your historical epics, your gut-wrenching war dramas, and of course, the larger-than-life musical. You read The Day the Earth Stood Still, some fluffy beach blanket bingos couldn't near dream of having a roadshow release, but your Ben-Hur's, your Dr. Zhivago's, and your West Side Stories made for prime fodder. Basically, Before the film goes into wide release, a studio would take it on the road for a limited, premium release. Ticket prices were at a premium compared to your average film screening, but the marketing appealed to a more luxuriant experience. To quote Mike Todd, the leading purveyor of roadshows in the 1950s, to show audiences got class and appreciate the arts, they'd be insulted if you didn't charge premium prices and make it a little hard to see. This way they don't have to rub elbows with the gum chewers. Roadshow movies were usually longer than your average release, did not include any shorts or trailers in front of them, and almost always had an intro. You can see this last element parodied in later movies, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Roadshow movies were presented with pre-recorded overtures on tracks and exit music to mimic an actual night at the theater. They almost always included a number of souvenirs and accoutrements for audience members to take home with them, including programs, pins, and all sorts of licensed merchandise. So if you were wondering who the if would ever buy a $12 Infinity War popcorn bucket, well, they're the precedent for that sort of thing. And to be clear, roadshows were not only for movie musicals. Gone with the Wind saw massive success with the roadshow marketing campaign, just that the format of the musical lent itself well to the roadshow, making them the most common and often the most popular. In effect, to buy a ticket to a roadshow movie was to build prestige around the movie, to make it feel more like an evening night or a Broadway show than just celluloid print. And if this sounds like a really expensive ploy to get butts into seats, it's because it is. Which is why most of these films had a roadshow in a limited release and ended up getting a theatrical cut wide release to most mainstream movie theaters. But a successful roadshow garnered not only premium ticket sales and more rentals from regular theaters, but also great word of mouth for a wide release, making them best case scenario a risky but profitable marketing method. So this marketing strategy works well for big budget movies for decades, and all seems well and good. But as movie studios were throwing this promotion at everything and anything being made, as well as hitting almost toddler levels of managing film budgets themselves, comes the 1950s, and there a new game in town. When you can get this wonderful new 17-inch Westinghouse set at a modest price. But here's the thing, fam. On top of the communists ruining everything, it's a television world now. I have dinners to make, and going to the movies makes it really hard to milk any sweet drops of affection from me loveless marriage. I don't want to haul ass all the way out of the house and drive 12 miles to Los Angeles to the Carthay Circle Theater. Why would I pay more to see a movie that's going to get a wide release in a few weeks anyway when I can watch Bonanza on the television from the comfort of my own home? Some recognize the increased dependency on huge roadshows as a dangerous game. According to Films and Filming in 1963, should these gigantic investments achieve the desired outcome, Hollywood may well have found the definitive and triumphant answer to the threat of television. Should they encounter defeat, the whole face of the film industry may be drastically changed. Will the public pay the higher prices made necessary by these colossal expenditures? Is there an audience sufficiently large to permit these pictures to emerge without a loss? Will these fabulously expensive films can and will filmgoers absorb? Around this same time, a string of expensive movie bombs nearly sink entire movie studios. The most infamous from this era being 20th Century Fox Cleopatra, a bomb of such gigantic proportions that it nearly tipped the studio into complete bankruptcy. Throw in the nascent cultural changes of the early mid-60s, and studios were starting to realize that the whole concept of the roadshow just wasn't worth the investment anymore, an aging relic that signaled it was time to let go and move on. And then something unexpected happened. Winds in the east, mist coming in, like something is brewing, about to begin, can't let me finger on what lays in store. I feel what's to happen, all happened before. The Hollywood movie a musical looks like it might be on its deathbed, and who should come along to revive it but Walt Disney and Mary Poppins. The film launches Julie Andrews' film career ironically after her getting snubbed from being cast in the role she originated on Broadway with My Fair Lady, and it won a ton of Academy Awards, including Best Actress for Andrews. Mary Poppins cost a relatively low $5.02 million to make, and it returned that amount at the box office quickly, and though it did not run as a roadshow feature in the United States, it did in London to great success. Moreover, the film was doing equivalent business to a roadshow release, and Poppins was what really convinced Disney that he should enter the roadshow musical business. We'll get to that. Then there was Warner Bros. My Fair Lady, the most expensive at the time production for the Link studio, which was about to be up for sale at the time. They cast Audrey Hepburn as Eliza Doolittle, a big star with a weaker voice to replace the Broadway originator of the role, Julie Andrews, and not only does the roadshow gambit pay off with a huge hit, it nets 8 Academy Awards. But then, oh boy, here comes the big guns. The Sound of Music is a big 1950s-style musical smack in the middle of the 1960s, and it does record box office numbers for a roadshow feature. The Sound of Music effectively single-handedly reversed the box office disaster 20th Century Fox had with Cleopatra, so when it looked like the big musical juggernaut was finally dying as the event movie trend in Hollywood, 3 big box office musical smashes happened one right after the other. Along with a wave of prestige that seemed to back up the phenomena, My Fair Lady, Poppins, and Music were nominated for a combined 35 Oscars and garnered a total of 18 wins. And studios lose their shit. So what do they do in the face of these massive successes? You gotta chase that trend. But the earlier prevailing wisdom was that roadshows and big-body 1950s-style Hollywood musicals were on their way out, and that was not wrong. They were very much on their way out. But studios were going to ignore this, to their own downfall. According to film historian Matthew Kennedy, in the 7 years that followed The Sound of Music, it became de rigueur for any film musical to be released in the roadshow format if they wanted to be rightfully labeled major, important, or lavish. The first cannery in this coal mine actually came from the Disney Company with The Happiest Millionaire, a roadshow release completed after Walt's death that bombed so spectacularly you've never heard of it. But this wasn't a huge investment, and it didn't tank the studio. Other studios did much, much worse. Warner Bros. Wants to recapture the success of My Fair Lady with another popular Broadway musical vehicle, Lerner, and Los Camelot, a romantic love triangle story based on White's The Once and Future King and a personal favorite of the Kennedy family. It was, by all accounts, the production from hell. Super expensive attention to detail of historical accuracy inflates the budget and causes delays. It featured the cast mostly from hell, namely its star, Richard Harris, who was drunk to a point of layability on set and constantly in giant fights with the producers, its third-party star as Lancelot, Italian actor Francis Nero, barely speaks English, and the production is plagued by delays. Most of its tremendously costly shoot in England is unusable, and all of this is going down while Warner Bros. Is being sold, and the studio's basically like, fuck it, whatever, just get it done. Ultimately, the film ends up costing $15 million, making it the second most expensive Warner Bros. Production after Me Fair Lady. And in the midst of all this, Roadshow prices flipped up from $2 to $6. And as we all know, raising prices for the exact same product for no reason to see the exact same thing is a great way to get butts into seats. Critical response to Camelot is dire. Whereas The Sound of Music got ripped hard for its sentimentality, but not much else, Camelot is almost universally panned, not just for its dated sense of traditionalism and sentimentality, but for a lot of technical reasons. Also, in contrast with musicals like The Sound of Music, no one gave a fuck about Camelot the musical before the film version, it having closed on Broadway in 1963 after a modest 3-year run. It didn't have the fervent fan base of other Broadway shows, nor did it have any artistically inspired moments à la Mary Poppins. And by 1967, movies like this are starting to feel like a relic. Isn't that Malcolm there? By this point, movies like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Bonnie and Clyde, and Help are revolutionizing cinema. But these movies are new, unpredictable, and studios wanted to continue sinking their money into what up until this point had been considered safe. It's incredible. It's impossible. But it's true. A man can talk to the animal. Hey, people liked Rex Harrison and My Fair Lady, and people loved Mary Poppins. Why not create an original musical based on an English children's book series that's also a vehicle for Harrison? At the time, Dr. Dolittle seemed like a good idea, given that a more child-friendly musical with a large cast of animals would reach a larger audience and also be ripe for the picking when it came to toyetic teens. But we have a problem. Rex Harrison is agent pain in the ass who, like Richard Harris, is tremendously difficult to work with. So Harrison leaves the film, and Christopher Plummer is brought on. But then, hey-o, Rex Harrison wants back in, and the studio is still contractually obligated to pay Plummer his agreed-upon salary. There was also the constant recasting of Bumpo, the prince of a fictional African kingdom. Yikes. Bumpo was originally supposed to be played by Sammy Davis Jr., whom Harrison refused to work with. Said Harrison, "I don't want to work with an entertainer. I want an actor, a real actor, not a song and dance man." But eventually the part was finally reduced, given to relatively unknown character actor Geoffrey Holder, who had his name changed to William Shakespeare X. Who had his God, this just keeps getting weirder. Oh, and animals. Oh, animals. $2 million of the budget were allotted to the animal-related costs, quarantine fees, which included a lot of giraffe-related mishaps, between one daying on set, trying to get Rex Harrison to ride on one, and a 3-day production delay that happened when, according to Doolittle choreographer, that giraffe stepped on his own cock. The film ended up costing $18 million, triple the original budget, and the final result is a mess. The roadshow for Doolittle became more of a focus group. They were editing it as they were taking it on the road, trying to trim it based on audience reactions, which was tepid to negative throughout. All this to say nothing of the exorbitant amount of merchandising that accompanied the movie, with over 300 official pieces of Dr. Doolittle swag, from bigness to pudding mix, worth $200 million, little of which sold. To quote a Fox promotion staffer years later, that thing Dr. Doolittle killed off merchandising TNs. Ha ha ha. Ha ha. For now. In the end, box office and critical response murdered Dr. Doolittle, with the movie only grossing $9 million off its $18 million budget, and it being derided as a boring movie laced with a white man's burden narrative and cartoonishly racist stereotypes of Africa. Its legacy is perhaps summed up best by producer Robert Zanuck. You look back now and ask, how could you have been so stupid? Dr. Doolittle was conceived in a period of euphoria. We were riding a musical wave that we didn't realize was going to come crashing down on the beach all at once. Sure, there were probably signs and warnings out there, but you were already so committed financially and emotionally that it's very hard to pull the plug on these big undertakings. Other films like Finian's Rainbow, Paint Your Wagon, and Man of La Mancha also underperformed during this weird glut period. But none landed with such an expensive thud as, well, hello, look who's here. Dolly. This is Lois. Hello, Lois. Dolly. On paper, Hello, Dolly seemed like a natural for film adaptation. A light-hearted romantic comedy that swept the Tony Awards in 1964 with a then record-breaking 10 wins. The casting of Barbra Streisand was bolstered by the success of Funny Girl a year before the film's release. Don't tell me not to live, just sit and put her life's Candy and the Sons, a ball of butter cementing Streisand as America's darling. But even then, the studio was ignoring how miscast Streisand was. Dolly Levy is supposed to be like middle-aged, she's in her 50s, and at the time, Barbra Streisand was 25. The casting choice also snubbed Broadway role originator Carol Channing for a younger, hotter actress in the title role, resulting in a Channing-Streisand feud that was arguably more interesting than the movie itself. But there were already concerns about the relevance of the film, which was about the romantic, sunny exploits of turn-of-the-century white New Yorkers from as high up as its own director Gene Kelly. To quote Kelly, "It's not the kind of film I would make as a first choice, but what else is there?" What happens now is that studios buy stage shows after they are already dated and then spends a lot of money turning them into dated movies. The musical is the victim of changing times. So even director Gene Kelly kind of knew that this was kind of a bad idea, but they went ahead and made it anyway. Initially, Dolly was given a budget of $10 million, with $1 million alone going to Barbra Streisand. Of course, this too fell into budget hell. Adding to that was a clause in the contract that Fox had struck with Broadway producer David Merrick, that is, that the film version of Dolly could not be released within 5 years of the original contract signing. By 1969, with the Broadway production still in healthy financial shape, Dolly had been sitting on the already cash-broke Fox's shelf for long enough. In the end, Fox broke their contract and promised Zanuck an additional $2 million, along with the promise to reimburse the Broadway production if its weekly box office fell below $60,000. And while Dolly seemed poised to do well, if not Sound of Music numbers at the box office, it did not have repeat viewers, audience admiration, or critical clout to keep up the momentum or even turn a profit for Fox. According to Matthew Kennedy, when Dolly finished production, 17 of the 25 top film rentals were road shows. In response, the industry prepared a bottleneck of reserved seats. A record-breaking 12 were scheduled for release over the last 4 months of 1968. Marketers faced a huge dilemma in catching people's attention amid the glut and convincing them that the roadshow experience was still worth the time, cost, and effort. With a roadshow opening practically every week, how do you market something as being special when it isn't special anymore? Said film critic Pauline Kael in the wake of the 1969 musical Paint Your Wagon. Giant musicals have finally broken the back of the American film industry. There is almost no way, short of a miracle, that Paint Your Wagon can recover its costs, although there are several other movies of this kind waiting to be released or to be completed, and at least one of them is even more expensive. It is highly unlikely that any new ones will be scheduled for production in the years to come, or perhaps ever. There were outliers to this trend, like Fiddler on the Roof and Cabaret. Fiddler was given the roadshow treatment, but carefully, and it sported no budget-breaking stars, names, or elaborate sets. Cabaret was not a road show, and very much falls into a more experimental, countercultural rubric that has little in common with films like Dolly. According to Matthew Kennedy, Foss made a musical for people who hated musicals. This wasn't the death of the musical, but it was the death of a certain type of musical. But at the same time, it still speaks to this continued Hollywood truism, Hollywood digging into certain ideas on what it considers safe long after these truisms are no longer true. At Pauline Kael in her review of Hello, Dolly. At just the time for great new movie musicals, the moguls who can't see further than the end of their cigars tell us that the form is dead. Dariloff Sanok says you can't make little musicals, and the rest of the industry seems to concur. I think they read dead wrong. I love musicals, but I hate big, expensive musicals because I have to wade through all the filler of production values to get what I want to see, and I suspect there are millions of people who feel the same way. We have seen time and time again the film industry having to fight not only to keep itself alive, but to keep it the most culturally relevant thing. How do you compete with media that doesn't require you to go anywhere, when you can get this wonderful new 17-inch Westinghouse set at a modest price? The fall of the Hollywood musical created the landscape that would lead to the era of the blockbuster. Jaws, Star Wars, Indiana Jones. We'd have gimmicks like Threed in the 1980s, which mercifully died until it came back. And it's back. I love it. Love of if. There was also the expansion of Seventim, which played well with films like Lawrence of Arabia, and eventually IMAX and Limax. The film industry upped its game with special effects that television, up until really recently, could never hope to compete with. And of course there was that God and 48ths bullshit with The Hobbit. And of course now we not only have Threed, we have Ford. But the rise and fall of the roadshow, Hollywood's focus on what they perceive as safe bets, as well as their desire for trends to never change so that they can predict them, speaks not only to the gimmicks Hollywood trees to keep on life support, but also to actual trends as well. But what is interesting to me is not so much the roadshow itself, but the insistence of throwing money into genres and gimmicks that audiences are showing increased antipathy for. Just look at the recent trailers for Titans and Venom, films that the studios made to respond to trends that died years ago, and the trailers to which were met with uproarious laughter, and yet someone edited in lines like "and whatever this is," and high-fived each other in the editing bay and went, "Yeah, Betas. How do you do, fellow kids?" Just as we didn't get from Why So Serious to Like a Turd in the Wind overnight, there was a time and a place for the movie and musical before they turned into self-parody. The ironic thing now is that Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again is this rare healthy being of a movie that actually isn't riding a dying trend and is responding to what a certain audience wants to see. There are a lot of wine moms out there, and they all bankrupting movie pass. With the merger of Disney and Fox, and the monopolization of an industry that was already incredibly insular, we are creeping back to that 1960s level of fewer movies being released and yet bigger and bigger budgets. And have we hit a point where between domestic and international markets, these movies are too big to fail and bring down the entire industry like it was in the 1960s? Probably not. Studios have gotten much better about at least not losing money the way they did in the 1960s, but with more and more money being funneled into fewer and fewer projects, the current state is beginning to resemble the studio system of the late 1960s, just ever so slightly more monopolistic. And again, one has to wonder where the studios are responding to a demand, or if they were trying to force a trend on life support when in the real world, audiences were over it a long time ago. Then we will eat your face right off your head like a turd in the wind. I've seen trends you people wouldn't believe. 48 frames per second bouncing off the shoulder of a storm giant. I've seen and smelled Ford versions of Josh Brolin's Thanos face that looks like forgotten bacon. All these moments will be lost in time, like turds in the wind. Time today. Who are we shilling for today? It's a Skillshare. Okay, so this episode was brought to you in part by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with over 20,000 classes in design, business, technology, and more. So one of the most common questions I get is just about the ins and outs of how one creates a video essay, and turns out they actually already have a class on that at Skillshare. It's done by fellow YouTuber, Wendover Productions, and he's already created a class about how he creates video essays, so if you want a tutorial, it's already there. As for me, I'll actually be creating a class for Skillshare later in the fall. It's going to be more about research. As you can see, this episode was very research heavy. How does one go about organizing their research? Well, we'll get to that. Premium membership gives you unlimited access to high-quality classes on must-know topics. The host must mention specific classes, categories. Oh, I already did that. I already mentioned specific. For me special offer, you can go down to this URL, and that gives you 2 months of access to over 20,000 classes for free. Start today. This episode was supported by viewers like you on Patreon. As you can see, here are their names in the credits. Some of them are even real names.